give us your analysis, because I know you spend a lot of time. I think it would help people to really understand what we're talking about. Go ahead.
Okay, the Roman Catholic religion is overseen and governed by the Pope in his Roman hierarchy, and as the Pope is overseen and directed by the Black Pope and his Jesuit order, because the Jesuits have always been the Pope's penholders, at least since 1814. Their real purpose under the guise of religion is to establish a universal monarchy on earth. In fact, I just obtained a copy of a book in French called The Kingdom of Solipsis. And if any of the listeners out there speak French or do any French translating, that would be wonderful to have the book put in English, because I do not know of a copy in English. So, and the purpose of this book that was written by the individual who was later almost assassinated was to show that the Jesuits are busy building an international world empire. Dostoevsky said the same thing in his The Grand Inquisitor, and he was considered to be the second greatest enemy of the Jesuit order who ever lived, second only to Blaise Pascal, who wrote the Provincial Letters. Mm-hmm. So that is their quest, and the Jesuit order is a military organization. That's why it's called the company, the military company. And the Jesuits are soldiers under strict discipline and absolute obedience. So it is, in fact, the U.S. Marine Corps is secretly patterned after the Jesuit order. When you go into the Marines, they break you down to nothing. They destroy your self-will, your individual identity while you're 12 weeks in that basic training, and then they make you into what they want you to be. It's the exact same thing with the Jesuit order, except it's not 12 weeks, it's 15 years of a Jesuit education before you're ready to be dispatched and be a soldier of Loyola. And so it's this Jesuit order that oversees the Pope and his Roman hierarchy. And the Pope is this modern-day Caesar. The Roman College of Cardinals is really nothing more than the Roman Senate. And they are governing a world empire, which Nino Novello calls in his great book, The Vatican Empire. They are governing a Vatican empire with huge cathedrals, huge property holdings, huge bank accounts, controlling massive corporations, all for the purpose of bringing all the nations of the world not only under the spiritual power of the Pope, but under the temporal power, the political power of the Pope, that he would rule the government of every nation. And when we understand the papacy as that, and realizing the Roman Catholic people, for the most part, know nothing of this, then we can begin to expose them, dig out the works of the past that have done such a wonderful job in this, and then calculate what they're doing now. And this is the most important part, because if we let them get away with what they're up to now, they will really have a victory. And that's the purpose, I believe, for our many broadcasts.
And I agree with you totally. Let's be a little specific before we get into the religious aspect of how they before we get into the secular aspect of how they operate around the world, influencing government officials and different country leaders, let's talk about specifically different religions and how they infiltrate them, starting with American Protestantism, moving to the Muslim religions, moving to the Muslims, also the Jews. Explain to us, we could start with those three, how they do this.
Okay. In the Jesuit Oath of the Fourth Vow, they take an oath that includes pretending to be a Protestant among Protestants, pretending to be a Muslim among Muslims, and pretending even to be, as to stoop so low, that's what it says, as to appearing to be a Jew, that we might all bring them back to Holy Mother Church and subordinate them to our Holy Father, the Pope. Mm-hmm. So this is what they do. And they have many, many strings and secret societies to effect this. Most of those secret societies are Masonic. And so what the Jesuits do in controlling the High Freemasons, High Scottish Rite Freemasons, York Rite, Grand Orient, whatever, these High Freemasons pretend to be Lutheran ministers. And so they come into the Lutheran Church and they begin to champion the doctrines of the Jesuits. Their classic doctrine is Molinism, or the doctrine of free will, that all men have a free will. And as they begin to champion free will, rather than the total depravity of man as the Bible teaches and as all Calvinists have taught, then that institution, that religious institution, gradually begins to be moved to embrace the papacy, which is the master of the doctrine of free will. If you look at Albert Pike's Morals and Dogma in the index, you will find several sentences in a row that talk about the free will of man, free will in this. So Freemasonry is a champion of free will. Free will is championed by the Jesuits, Molina and Suarez. And so as you begin to convert Protestant leaders into pro-Jesuit doctrines, you then can use those Protestant leaders to be soft on Rome, to want to embrace Rome, which ultimately leads to the individuals in the church embracing the papacy's temporal power by not voting and keeping out those agents who are pro-pope, pro-papacy. So as goeth the church, so goeth the government. Islam, for example, the Jesuits were the ones really responsible for the founding of Wahhabi Islam in the 1700s with Sir Richard Burton and some others. And so as the Jesuits created Wahhabism and ultimately gave the Wahhabis control of Saudi Arabia, making Ibn Saud the king of Saudi Arabia in 1932 with the help of the fascist Benito Mussolini, whose advisor was the secretary of the Society of Jesus, Pedro Taci Venturi. The Jesuits have complete control of high-level Islam by way of the Knights of Malta, because Sir John Philby was a Knight of Malta. He was in the special council of King Ibn Saud there in Saudi Arabia. And of course, Sir John Philby was the father of Kim Philby, who is a CIA agent, a British MI5, MI6 agent, and a KGB agent, who later supposedly defected, quote-unquote, and spent the rest of his life in Moscow. So the Jesuits control Islam, and they also control the high-level Masonic Orthodox Jews. And it is these Orthodox Jews who are the champions of the Talmud and the Noahide laws that the Jesuits control, because many of these high Jews are Freemasons, and the chief rabbis, the rabbis in Israel, entertained the Pope when he came to Jerusalem. Any self-respecting rabbi would distance himself from the Pope, especially John Paul II, because he was very much involved in the Eurasian Jewish Holocaust, making Zyklon B and the IG Farben manufacturing plant there at Auschwitz. So these high rabbis betray their own people. These high Protestant leaders like Billy Graham and others who are Masons betray their own people. And these high Muslims like Bin Laden and the Saud dynasty and others all betray the Muslim people. So at the top, all these leaders are working together, and they will never blink at the sacrificing of their own people, quote-unquote, ad majorem Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God, as the Jesuits say, to bring the world closer and closer to a universal monarchical rule, uniting all religions under the headship of that man of sin, the Pope.
Right. Now, once we take, and we've talked specifically before about how they infiltrate these different groups, but I wanted to switch now to not being satisfied with just taking over and infiltrating religions. And I might add, if you look at all the signs now, the Anglican bishops in England now stating they want to put the Anglican Church under the authority of the Pope. The Pope recently coming out stating in his Good Friday, I guess he's going to state in a new message that he's asking for all Jews to convert to Catholicism. That will be coming out shortly. I mean, Tony Blair becoming a Catholic. You see this kind of uniting of everybody under the Pope in so many different ways. In fact, somebody on my show mentioned it was historical that 3 presidents, never before in the history of our country, did 3 sitting presidents, or 3 former, 1 sitting and 2 former presidents, go to the funeral of a pope. This never occurred in the past. You see all these connections. Henry Kissinger, now a papal advisor, and it goes on and on and on. But they're not satisfied so much just with religion. They want to enter into the political realm of most countries. Tie the knots together behind how they operate, what's going on now between Israel, Iran, Iraq, our country, how they manipulate and control at the high levels all these people working for the same cause, a one-world government. Go ahead.
Okay, the Black Pope, Jesuit Superior General Peter Hans Kohlenbach is the most powerful man in the world. He controls not only all the Masonic secret societies, he also controls the Pope and the Roman hierarchy. He also controls the Knights of Malta. He also controls Opus Dei. He controls all the secret societies and all the men of that we would call them the historic Crusaders. The Knights Templars, which are now the Masons of today, and the Knights Hospitallers, who are the Knights of Malta today. Every branch of the Knights of Malta. And so as he controls these brotherhoods that you enter into on oath, usually blood oaths, it is these brotherhoods who control what I call in my book the Black Pope's international intelligence community. What I mean by that is that the Central Intelligence Agency, the NSA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the FBI, the Military Intelligence Agency, all these intelligence agencies in the United States are working together under the Jesuits in control of the Archbishop of New York City, Edward Cardinal Egan. And so this is the government that they have in this country. They've divided this country into 10 provinces, and there are 10 Jesuit provincials over the United States. There is one Jesuit assistant who is there in Rome with the Jesuit Superior General advising as to the political climate, economic climate, and so on of all the provinces so as to be able to make calculating moves to further destroy the Reformation in this country. It's the same way in Britain. The Archbishop of Westminster, he is controlled by the Jesuits of Stonyhurst. The Jesuit provincial resides at Stonyhurst. And so he oversees the Archbishop of Westminster, and the Archbishop of Westminster oversees British MI5, MI6 in Scotland Yard. So as you have these archbishops, wherever they might be, for example, you have the Patriarch of Moscow. He is a Roman Catholic after with the Eastern Rite, and the Patriarch there of Moscow, he oversees the FSB, the SVR, all the intelligence agencies in Russia. The Vatican runs an international empire, and it has a chain of command. And how they run it here in the U.S. is exactly how they run it in Russia, is exactly how they run it in China, is exactly how they run it in Britain and Europe. And so as we understand this pattern, this government that they organize, then we can understand how they rule. So, for example, Osama bin Laden and Saddam Hussein were both high-level Freemasons and CIA assets. There is no Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden without them being created by the Central Intelligence Agency. And yet both these high Muslims are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood out of the Grand Orient Lodge in Cairo. And so therefore these high Muslim Freemasons, along with the late King of Jordan, they will do exactly what they are told by Vatican agents there in their court. And as they do exactly what they are told, the President Bush and Prime Minister Blair, they will do exactly what they are told by the Vatican agents advising them. At 9/11, for example, the one who was advising George Bush was Knight of Malta, George J. Tenet, who was trained by the Jesuits at Fordham University, the School of Foreign Service. And he was National Security Council, a very important guy, said it was a slam dunk, et cetera, et cetera. And so George J. Tenet was the Jesuits' advisor directly to George Bush. And so that he wouldn't go to jail for what he did, he resigned and is now protected. It's the same way with Tony Blair. He has his Jesuit advisors, and he will do exactly what he's told. Now, if these men who are in positions of power over these agencies, over the Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, whatever, if these men do not do what they are told, they are removed with either death or being discredited, because the Jesuit order has a very active assassination squad throughout all the nations of the earth, controlled by the intelligence communities, as well as the international Sicilian Mafia, which is also controlled by the Jesuits. And the Mafia the Russian Mafia, Sicilian Mafia, the American Mafia, all controlled by the Vatican through high-level Freemasonry and the Knights of Malta. They work in conjunction with the international military intelligence agencies as well as the civilian intelligence agencies. And I prove this in my book on the Kennedy assassination, that the CIA and the Mafia work together, and indeed what was portrayed in JFK is absolutely true. So this is the system that they work. And we can go into banking. The Knights of Malta control all the major banks, Citibank, Morgan Trust, all the major banks of New York City, and especially, of course, the Federal Reserve Bank that was in New York City that was overseen by Knight of Malta, an Irish Roman Catholic, William J. McDonough, for several years, and who's a CFR member. So the Vatican controls all the banking systems. That's where they run their drug trade money through to launder their money. They control all the gold. They have hoarded all the gold in various gold hoards. In the United States, the gold hoard is in the Federal Reserve Bank in the basement with over 600,000 gold bars there. Most of it stolen from us American people when they stole our gold coins in 1933 and melted them down. And so they control the gold hoards. They control the currencies of all the nations because all the currencies are worthless. And so they can create anything they want to by their monopoly on credit and the creation of these debt notes, which are the currencies of all the nations. So this is the kind of power that they have. And unless this is exposed and preached against in pulpits, they will continue to advance their cause.
Exactly. And once we get to the topic of war, and we talk about the Iraqi war, I think it's interesting and also important for you to tell the American people that we know that the war is an illegal war, but many people don't understand that the Iraqi leaders, the Israeli leaders, the Palestinian leaders, the Iranian leaders, the American leaders, and others are all working together to foster these wars. So it is making it look as if each country is fighting against another, when in fact, at the top levels, they are orchestrating it. And I'd like you to comment on that.
That's absolutely correct. And in my book, I deal with a chapter 37, called The Second 30 Years' War. It's about 150 pages. And I show during World War II, or from 1914 to 1945, which I call the Second 30 Years' War, that it was a war, first of all, against the male population, the white, Protestant, and liberal Catholic male populations of Europe during World War I, killing all those young men and soldiers, deliberately sacrificing them at Passchendaele, at the Somme, at Verdun, with no evidently intent to win on the part of the Germans or on the part of the French and Americans.
Eric, we're going to take a break in about 30 seconds here, so why don't we start right there with World War I and work our way through showing the American people how they are manipulated by top government officials from all over the world. Back for the second hour of the Investigative Journal. I'm your host, Greg Szymanski, on the Investigative Journal on LibertyRadioLive.com. That's LibertyRadioLive.com. My guest is Eric John Phelps, author of Vatican Assassins. You can get his book at VaticanAssassins.org, and please do, because it's well worth reading. It's a long 1,500-page book, but it goes by quickly because the information in there is invaluable information that you don't get anywhere else. And I'll tell you, it should be read by every American because it starts to put the pieces together. And I can't tell you how many people have told me that after listening to Eric and other people that talk in this manner. Bill Hughes is one that comes to mind right now in his book, The Secret Terrorists. And the response is usually this: finally I can figure out why these wars are taking place. What is going on in our country? This connects the dots. It's a story that you should be heard by every American. But unfortunately, we have a media that's corrupted, controlled by the same people we talk to, by the way, and we need to expose this. And with that, we may have a hope of bringing back freedom and freedom of religion and other things in this country that are really what we stand for. So, Eric, go ahead. We left off explaining to people how at the top levels all these government leaders are somehow networked and working together, and you need somebody to do that, and you have pointed out that it's usually the Jesuit order that's behind much of these nefarious acts. So you left off at World War I. Go ahead.
There's a Jesuit order behind all your high-level Freemasons. That's how they accomplish their tasks. And they put up the smoke screen that high-level Freemasonry is against the Vatican, which is pure hogwash. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll go beginning with 1914 and 1945. Remember, Europe was going through a wonderful time of renovation of culture. New inventions were happening. Germany was the first to have a steam engine, and it just so happened in Germany that they expelled Kaiser Wilhelm I and Bismarck expelled the Jesuits in 1872 from all of the Reich, the Second Protestant Reich, and then they enfranchised 550,000 Jews that were living in Prussia and throughout the country, so that those Jews could then pursue their trades. And when you allow the Jewish people to pursue their trades in a country, your country benefits, period. And that's exactly the promise of Genesis 12, when the Lord said to Abraham concerning his seed, whosoever blesses your seed I will bless, and whosoever curses your physical seed I will curse. So Germany began to prosper tremendously with the allowing the Jews to pursue their trades and enfranchising them and allowing them to have some say in government. Now, the Jesuits hated this, and so they put Germany on their hit list. And so what they did is they put together the Center Party, and it was headed by Franz von Papen, who was a Knight of Malta, and it was the Center Party in 1917 with Matthias Erzberger, who was later assassinated by the Jesuits, who allowed the Jesuits to re-enter Germany in 1917. So from 1872 to 1917, the Jesuit order and its redemptorists, which are nothing more than Jesuits of the right arm, were banned from Germany and could not step foot in the country. In Russia had banned the Jesuits in 1820 with the great Alexander I, the Tsar Alexander I, kicked them out of all the Russias in 1820 with a new case and forbid them to ever return to Russia because of their political meddling in the affairs of the Romanovs and the Orthodox Church, of which the Romanovs were the protectors. And so here the Jesuits are expelled from Russia. So there, have to sneak in, and they're busy seeking to overthrow the Romanovs and overthrow the Orthodox Church. And so we have World War I as punishment for Russia for expelling the Jesuits. And the Bolshevik Revolution takes place. And what's one of the first things Lenin does after the Civil War? In 1922, he formally readmits the Jesuits into Russia. What happens towards the end of World War I after Ludendorff betrays the German soldiers, leaves 1 million of them on the Eastern Front deep in Russia when he should have brought all those that million soldiers onto the Western Front where they could have easily defeated the French? What did he do? He betrayed the German people, and then ultimately the Jesuits are allowed in 1917. The Treaty of Versailles is set up, and what does that do? It guarantees war in 20 years. We have Britain. What happens to the Protestant British Empire during World War I? It's nearly its entire shipping fleet, in excess of 500 ships, were U-boated, were destroyed by torpedoes, and those U-boats used to dock in Ireland under the good graces of the Jesuits so they could be refueled. And then as a result of that, the British shipping of the British Empire was destroyed, which further destroyed the Protestant British Empire, who with the King James Bible had brought the gospel to the ends of the earth. So what we have here is the Jesuits pitting these nations one against another, all the while coordinating the leaders of this country. The same can be said for Woodrow Wilson when he illegally brought the United States into World War I. We had an isolationist policy. That was the policy of James Monroe. We should have never entered into European affairs. But Woodrow Wilson was an agent of the Jesuits in helping to set up the Lusitania affair along with Winston Churchill, which then ultimately led the U.S. into World War I, and the Army was led by the high-level Freemason, Black Jack Pershing. So all the nations are working together, subject to the Jesuit order, to accomplish what the Vatican wants to do. So World War I killed millions of the finest British men, of the finest white Protestant German men, of the finest white Protestant American men, of the finest liberal Roman Catholic men, French men who couldn't stand the Jesuits. Remember, France had expelled the Jesuits in 1902, so the Jesuits were going to take vengeance on Roman Catholic France. So all these nations now were to be punished by this huge conflagration called the Great War. And yet this is never brought out. The religious element is never brought out in any history that you ever read. Well, What happens then is after World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution takes place, the Spanish Civil War takes place with the Jesuits, because they'd been kicked out of Spain in 1932. The papacy raised a Franco to prepare to kill every Spaniard in order to restore the temporal power over Spain. What did he do? Killed some 600,000 Spanish liberals who all they wanted was freedom of conscience. They massacred the Spanish Protestants in the bull rings with tanks. So you have the Spanish Civil War taking place, and then ultimately they bring FDR to power, who is really a fascist advocating communist designs. He is secretly working via J. Edgar Hoover with Heinrich Himmler, and thus the Great Depression, managed here by three Irish Roman Catholics who short-sold Tom Bragg, Ben Smith, and Joe Kennedy, that Great Depression then enthrones not only FDR, but also Adolf Hitler in 1933. So all of this is being coordinated together so that with the second half of the Second 30 Years' War, the Jesuits will not only destroy the manhood of these nations, they're going to destroy the populations. And this is what we have going on in Iraq right now. As I said at the beginning of this crusade, it is a war of annihilation against primarily the Shiites of Iraq, and it will go against the Shiites of Iran, because it was the Shiites who expelled the Jesuit order from Iraq in 1969 out of their Baghdad University, and for that the Jesuits used the CIA to raise up Saddam Hussein to come to power there around in 1971 or so, and put that nation under murder and blood up to this very moment.
And tell us how they manipulated all these leaders in the Middle East and in America now, and bring us up to date on what they've planned. You know, we understand the Iraqi war, but how they've entered in, how they've got them all working together, and where this is going to lead in the future, how this is going to escalate in your estimation.
Well, as I've said for probably the last 5 years, at the Con, I met a gentleman there who was a speaker. I can't remember his name right now, but I was utterly shocked and floored when he said it. He said James Angleton wanted a war with Islam since about 1970. Of course, James Angleton was a Knight of Malta. He'd been given the Cross of the Knights of Malta. I believe it's the second highest award, because of his work with the Vatican rat lines and helping Nazis escape out of Europe, et cetera, and setting up the Cold War. And so it was James Angleton and another co-conspirator in the Kennedy assassination who called for a war against Islam. Well, this makes perfect sense, because the Muslim peoples reproduce rapidly. And as they teach their children to hate the Jews there in Israel, which the Pope calls his Kingdom of Jerusalem, they then become a threat to the overrunning of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And if the Kingdom of Jerusalem would be overrun by the Muslims, as Saladin did back in the 13th century, there could be no rebuilding of the Hebrew temple, which the Pope has always wanted to do since the Crusades. So this is a war of annihilation against the Muslim people to cut down their population, while at the same time encouraging them to move into Europe and into North America, so that when we have our next 9/11, so that when we have our next nuclear detonations, destroying what the Jesuits want to do, they then can attack Mecca and Medina using American military forces. And I believe there's already nuclear devices there in those mosques in Mecca and Medina. Remember, Mecca is the first holiest religious mosque for all Muslims. That's where the Kaaba is. And there very well may be a nuke within the Kaaba. And the second holiest place for all the Muslims is Medina. And the third holiest place is the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. Well, I believe that as soon as we have our next 9/11 and whatever edifices the Jesuits destroy will be blamed on the Muslims, they then will detonate Mecca and Medina. This will incite all the Muslims in the United States to hate Americans, and this will push all the whites primarily, the white Roman Catholic, the white apostate Protestant, and the white atheists, into a right-wing fascist camp prepared by Fox News for us, so that these fascist new Nazis will then round up the Muslims and send them to the huge concentration camps, especially the huge one southeast of Fairbanks, Alaska, which is in excess of 1 million square miles. So I believe this is what they intend to do, and then the nation, the U.S., will be put on a total war footing. It seems that Canada will be annexed to the United States, even as Hitler annexed Austria, and the U.S. will then have access to all the oil in Canada to conduct its huge crusade against Islam. But then we will ultimately have a two-front war against China, for which reason the Panama Canal at this moment is being widened, so that the huge tankers and aircraft carriers of China and of the United States can pass through the canal in conducting this huge war that's to come in the Far East. And ultimately then our Navy, after it has accomplished the killing that it's supposed to do, will be betrayed by our own high command, even as Hitler betrayed his armies east in Russia. And then our coast will be open for invasion, and we will experience our Sino-Soviet Muslim invasion that has been planned in this country since no later than the Bolshevik Revolution.
Yeah, and the only way this can be accomplished if all the leaders are on the same page.
That's right. We have to have high-level treason in our military and in our politics. And as long as that treason doth prosper, because none dare call it treason, it will continue to go this way. We're having the building of the North American Union. The Roman hierarchy in this country is completely behind it, letting all the Mexican alien Roman Catholics into this country illegally so that they can further Catholicize our southern borders, and ultimately they're going up into Canada. And what's happening? The Jesuits Bank of America is extending credit to them so they can get bank accounts without socialist insecurity numbers, and so that they can get mortgages to purchase homes. The Vatican, with their banking powers in this country, are making it possible for them to stay here. Meanwhile, they're not being deported as any other civilized nation would enforce its laws and deport any alien invader. If you go into Mexico illegally, you do a stint in jail up to 6 years. Not here. So they're creating the North American Union between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, which will be the Axis power in this huge crusade, just as they created the Axis power in Europe with Roman Catholic Mexico, advanced Germany, and the annexed Austria. The parallels are striking. Exactly. So as they're doing this, we're losing our national sovereignty, and national sovereignty was born out of the Protestant Reformation. There was no national sovereignty before the Reformation. All the kings of Europe did the bidding of the Pope. And if they didn't, they were killed or disfranchised from their throne. And if the people didn't follow the Pope, the king went after and persecuted the people. It's only with the Reformation that you have national sovereignties like the once great United States of America. Well, all this is being destroyed, and it's on chart for the 21st century for this to happen in the midst of a huge conflagration that Rome is planning between the Muslim world and the historic white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nations, so that after this, Europe will be supreme in the earth as a military and financial power. China will be supreme in the east, with Japan and Taiwan and South Korea all in its chain, and Africa will be united, having killed out all the historic white white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of Zimbabwe or Rhodesia and South Africa, and it will be under the King of the South, and we will have this huge confederation as prophesied in the Scripture with the rebuilding of the Third Temple and the rebuilding of the ancient treasure commercial city Babylon on the Euphrates River.
Right, and 9/11 was putting our country on notice of what they planned. I mean, we've seen, what's happened after 9/11, escalated violence constantly. Before we get into that subject, what do you think they have planned for us next? Because, I will quote General, his name is General Parton, and he agrees, and he's looked at this. He's a really experienced military intelligence expert who has said, their plan is definitely to wear us down, to put us in fear. 9/11 will only be followed by something even more drastic, although he wasn't sure who, what or when. What is your thoughts about their next event to further this, the wars we're talking about?
Well, I feel from all the flags that the Jesuits are sending up in their Hollywood theater and their intelligence agencies that they will most assuredly have a series of detonations, surgical small detonations in several countries and several cities within the United States, and I'm convinced one of them will be Washington, D.C., because they intend to move the capital to Denver, as I've shown in previous broadcasts out of John Roy Colson's book Undercover, when he went undercover in the late 30s and early 1940s, going into the American fascist presence, and the fascists then said they were going to move the capital to Denver. So that's exactly what they want to do, and then once they move their capital to Denver, they can have their huge military operation there where they can coordinate the war from the center of the country. So they're going to have detonations, and they'll probably have the detonations in the largest Jewish communities in the United States. Those communities, being New York City somewhere, Miami, or the Golden Coast, and Los Angeles. Those are the three largest Jewish communities in the country. And remember, there are as many Jews in North America as there are in Israel and the rest of the world, in excess of 6 million. So they are a target for annihilation by the fascists, run by the Vatican in this war. That's one of the things they want to do. The next thing they want to do is they want to eliminate ultimately the Muslims that they have brought here through their control of the immigration office. And they're going to use the Muslims for agitation, for possibly killing Jews, but then ultimately through this Muslim agitation, whose leaders are controlled at the top, will then justify sending them to concentration camps, as that one movie portrayed. I can't remember the name of it, but it had Bruce Willis in it. He was a military commander who was rounding up the Muslims. He had rounded up a Muslim young man whose father was in the FBI. Denzel Washington was in the movie too. The Muslims are blamed for blowing up a bus. That scenario that they unfold there is what I believe they most intend to do with the Muslim people. And the Mexicans that they brought here, they consider the Mexican Roman Catholics they brought into this country as the low population of Mexico. And it will not take much to incite the American people through the crime that all these Mexicans are committing every day against us, to round them up and throw them in concentration camps, thereby eliminating, quote-unquote, the low population of Mexico that Vincenzi Fox helped to get out of here in the first place. So they have a war against certain populations that they have decreed, as well as the fall of the Western nations, which they intend to do, that will in the end build Europe, that will make the kingdom of Jerusalem safer so that the temple can be rebuilt after this crusade, and ultimately with the war of annihilation going on in Iraq, so that they can end the rebuilding of what begins to be Babylon in the city of Dubai, where no Jew is allowed. They're going to rebuild that ancient treasure city.
Yeah, that's an analysis that I hope everybody listened to and takes seriously. I did want to spend some time today on 9/11 since it is the 6th anniversary of that event. And one of my main concerns in the beginning was to research it as someone who would investigate a murder or a conspiracy to commit murder. And one of the things I found from the beginning was the covering of evidence, the lack of a solid investigation, and also never do any of these truth movements get to the real perpetrators. Yesterday on my show, Leo Zagami from Italy said he's amazed. You know, he understands why, because these people are protected, but he showed how easy it is to get to the bottom of these people by going to one man. Just for example, why hasn't, he said, Ugo Ballestieri, who's the head of the New York Rotary Club, who was involved in knowing about 9/11 prior to this, Leo heard him speaking about it, why wasn't he investigated, and why is he in control now of a company that controls our airports? And he says that if you trace him and other people, it will lead to Rudolph Giuliani and others in the Vatican. And so the one point I wanted to make was, two, I wanted to get your comments about what you think they've done to the truth movement in 9/11, and why haven't, Americans taken seriously the real perpetrators, being, high-level Vatican officials and also high-level officials in our government. What is stopping this investigation from your point of view?
Well, number one, the Jesuits control the Council on Foreign Relations through the Archbishop of New York. The Council on Foreign Relations provides the men who are in leadership positions within the executive branch of government, as well as the Senate and the Supreme Court. But primarily, these men occupy places of power. One of those men was Alberto Gonzales. Alberto Gonzales, I saw him in an interview with Peter G. Peterson, who was the past president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Peter G. Peterson is a high-level Freemason. He has an honorary doctorate from Georgetown Jesuit University. And Alberto Gonzales was his pet dog, obviously, as the interview was proceeding.
Mm-hmm.
Alberto Gonzales, on orders from George Bush, and maybe even Dick Cheney, fired some key U.S. attorneys who were investigating crimes that are not allowed to be investigated. For example, the order was given to fire Carol Lamb, who was a prominent U.S. attorney, I believe in California. She was investigating the deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency. You don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in the CIA, the officers in the CIA, are untouchable. And so because she had the courage to do this, she was terminated. She's lucky she wasn't killed. And so Carol Lamb was finished. And the same way with a couple of others. So when you're the Attorney General of the United States under the aegis of George Bush, and thus the Council on Foreign Relations, and remember the Bush family are Knights of Malta. George Herbert Walker Bush and his brother Prescott Bush Jr. are both Knights of Malta. When you're under that kind of power, financial and political, controlled by the Vatican, you do what you're told, or you're going to lose your job. So that's exactly what Gonzales did. He fired those U.S. attorneys, and the powers that be remain untouchable. That's what happens when the Vatican controls your political arena in your country. That is called the Pope's temporal power. And if you go to the Department of Justice, the gate that opens up to the front door there in Washington, D.C. on the corner, you have a bundle of rods with an axe protruding on the inside of each one of the gates. It tells you that the Department of Justice is fascist. So they're not going to go after any of the Pope's boys. Robert Morgenthau, who's the district attorney in New York City, he will never prosecute anybody involved with the pedophile ring because it's controlled by the Archbishop there, Edward Cardinal Regan. They control all your legal avenues for punishment of crime. And that's why nothing has been done about 9/11. Nobody's going to get prosecuted. Nobody's going to jail. There's not even going to be an investigation. I mean, the Department of Justice could at least say, well, Leo Zagami has said that Giuliani was involved. I think we need to subpoena Giuliani, and we need to subpoena Zagami. We need to ask them some questions.
Or Ballestieri, the head of the New York Rotary Club.
Ballestieri. See, they have the power of subpoena. They have the power to conduct an investigation. That's the purpose of government, to punish evil and reward good. They could easily subpoena George J. Tenet. and say, well, now, what do you know of the bringing down of the World Trade Center, Mr. Tennant? After all, you're a knight of Malta. You're subject to the Archbishop of New York. You are on the National Security Council. Do you have anything to say about any ties there? Because, you know, the New York Port Authority was owned and controlled by the Archbishop. And the selling off of the World Trade buildings was the first time it ever happened since they're building one in the 1980s, and they sold it to a Jew so that they could blame the Jews for bringing down the World Trade Center. This is how they calculated that. And so they could subpoena, for example, Avery Cardinal Dulles, whose uncle was Allen Dulles, the former head of the CIA, and Avery Cardinal Dulles is one of the foremost Jesuits at Fordham University in New York City that oversees the Archbishop. They can subpoena him and say, what do you know about 9/11? I say that Avery Cardinal Dulles should be subpoenaed. He should be indicted. I say that George J. Tennant should be indicted. I say William F. Buckley should be indicted. All these high-level Knights of Malta that are in places of power, George Herbert Walker Bush and others, they all ought to be indicted for conspiracy. It would be easy to find witnesses. But then again, the intelligence agencies come into play, like the CIA. And then they're going to have assassination of witnesses, either through the Central Intelligence Agency, the FBI, or the Mafia. This is the kind of power they wield.
And they can, as proven, pull off the 9/11 tragedy while killing more than 3,000 people. And they have no qualms about doing it.
That's correct, because you see, we are animals to them. We are the goy. We are the animals. We are just beasts to be sheared or to be eaten or to be sacrificed to their delight. That's how they look at us. We're not any part of the adept. We're not part of the brotherhood. So we can be managed and controlled by them. They have the utmost contempt for us. Mm-hmm. I saw recently on C-SPAN, of all places, just a couple nights ago, William Rodriguez in a presentation in the Presbyterian Church in Los Angeles, where he tells of his experience in the North Tower on 9/11, because he was a Puerto Rican janitor there that had the key to all the doors. And he tells this unbelievable story, how there was a huge explosion in the basement, blew out the elevators on the first floor, how all the marble came crashing down. When he finally came down from the 23rd floor, it was all crashed down, and he wondered what happened here. And then he tells about the huge explosion underground, and because of that, the water was racing in, and people were crying out, "We're drowning, we're drowning." He tells about the series of explosions when he was up on those floors. Bang, 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 bang. And then he went down to the stairs, and he was the last person that escaped out of the North Tower, and he dove under a fire truck, for which reason he survived.
Right.
He would be an excellent person to have on the show. All of this points to the fact that there was a massive conspiracy in the detonation and bringing down of those buildings and the murder of those people, and yet nobody gets investigated. They cordon it off. They take all the steel that had been sheared by those charges and ship it to China, where they have no prima facie evidence of conspiracy.
Eric, let's pick it up right there. We're going to take a 3-minute break. We'll be back after the short message. Back for the final half hour of the Investigative Journal. My guest is Eric John Phelps, and we're discussing for this last half hour, for most of it, the 9/11 tragedy. Today's the 6th anniversary of 9/11, as most of you are aware. And Eric, you did bring up William Rodriguez, the janitor in the North Tower, the last man out, and dove under a bus or a fire truck to save his life. A few years ago, I was one of the first people to bring him forward to the American people. If you go to my website at arcticbeacon.com and go back several years, you'll find articles written about him. And also, he'd been on my radio show numerous times.
Wonderful.
Years ago. Well, I spent 10 days with William in 2005 in New York, when just before he got married. He was living in New Jersey. And I had an opportunity to talk with him and to write about him extensively, but also to tell you that his story categorically shows that this could not have been jet fuel, and the bombs and explosions were coming from below, and they occurred split second after the plane hit above. Now, in his office, they were congregated in his office in the North Tower below in the basement. There's 4 or 5 levels, and there were at least a dozen or more people in that office, all who would testify to the same thing. We also found, and I also talked to numerous people who were trapped in elevators below. I talked to a man by the name of Felipe David, who was burned at an elevator below in the North Tower just after the explosion took place below, and he said the flames came up from below and burned him. He spent almost 6 months, I believe it was 6 months in the hospital and survived. Then I talked with people trapped in elevators below, people in just numerous people who all would testify to the same thing. The most interesting thing about this is William Rodriguez and all these people were never allowed to tell their story to the 9/11 Commission, and it was never included in the report. That's the real key to this. The investigation should have talked to every one of those people, and it would have showed, without a doubt, that there were explosions below that tower, and it couldn't have been the airplanes. But as we know, this has been covered up. So that fact is just what happened then. After really researching and finding so much evidence to show that this was the government story was not true, I felt it was a time to move forward, to try and concentrate on the real perpetrators, because you could spend your life gathering evidence and never get it heard, and that's exactly what they want you to do.
That's right.
I might add. You know what I'm saying, Eric?
Well, that's right. They want you to completely occupy yourself in gathering evidence for years and years. Meanwhile, the moment to strike has fled from us. We have to strike while the iron is hot. It's fresh on the minds of people. Their loved ones are dead. They don't see any redress and anybody going after them. Now it's time to point the finger at the papacy. Edward Cardinal Egan, thou art the man. You and your American branch of the Knights of Malta, controlling our intelligence communities. And Avery Cardinal Dulles, you Jesuit out of Fordham, you oversaw the Archbishop with other Jesuits at Fordham. And there were Jesuits at Georgetown involved too. We need to point the finger and without any reversion back and tell the people it's the Vatican enforcing its temporal power over this country, using our military as the slayers for the papacy in their crusades against people after people. If it's not the Serbs, it's the Muslims. If it's not the Muslims, it's somebody else. So they continue to use our blood and treasure to carry out their designs. This needs to be brought out more and more because you're doing it. One of the few that's doing it. I believe more and more people are catching on. I have people contacting me from Europe on a regular basis. Thank you for this, Mr. Phelps. It finally makes sense what they did to us in Europe and now what they're doing now in this crusade. So people, when they get this key, they begin to see things through these eyes, and then they have evidence after evidence after evidence that validates this position. So as we do this, it's like a snowball, and it will have its effect. It will get bigger and bigger, and I do not believe the Jesuit order will be able to stop it, because I believe it's the Lord, and the Lord is raising up a standard against these sinners.
Exactly, and when we just talk about 9/11 and the tragedy that took place, gathering the evidence is the key. And if they control that, we can never put the elements of murder together with substantial evidence, because in a murder case or a conspiracy to commit murder, the real key is to get the evidence gathered so that each element of the crime can be proven and the perpetrators then put in jail for their crimes. Well, what they've done is systematically covered that up with a phony 9/11 investigation, by getting all the hard evidence away as immediately as possible from the World Trade Center, and then allowing people, not even pursuing the eyewitnesses and the victims like William Rodriguez. And as the years go by, I see his message becoming faint, more faint in the distance, because as a crime scene, the longer you stay away from it, the harder it is to nab the people who did it, and they know that. And so as the years go by, William Rodriguez says to the top of his lungs, I know it wasn't how they said it. It just, his message becomes fainter and fainter and fainter to the point where it no longer will ever lead to any justice. Now, what happens then is they manipulate the 9/11 movements so that every year they put people in control so that, that these movements can't gather enough momentum to force any kind of investigation. And so you're left with one option. And I feel that's the reason I've dedicated the last couple of years to this. And that is to find out who's at the top, alert people how they operate, so that maybe someday, if those people are outed, we can get to the bottom. Because as I interviewed a woman who lost her daughter, and she was 3 months pregnant at the time, a beautiful woman, her daughter was 24 years old or 25 years old, and she was 3 months pregnant, and she died running out of the South Tower. One of the 250 bodies that were recovered that you can identify. And all she told me, and her name is Donna Marsh, she just said, Greg, all I want to do is find out who killed my daughter. I am so disgusted with the 9/11 movement, how they operate. I'm so disgusted with our investigations. Somebody's got to get to the top of this and find it out. And I remember those words because just think about it, Eric. If you lost somebody close, you'd want to know who did it, wouldn't you?
Sure would. I would be stricken with grief, but I think my anger would exceed my grief when the government refuses to find the murderer.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's what happened to me when I wrote the book. I was terribly grief-stricken over the killing of President Kennedy. My teacher in 4th grade crying in the class. I'll never forget that traumatic experience. And I thought, I'm going to find who did this someday. And it took a long time, but I finally did, and then put it out in the book. And then hopefully more people will see, well, if they did it then, if Cardinal Spellman, the Archbishop of New York, had the power to kill John F. Kennedy, and then cover it up with his FBI and J. Edgar Hoover and the CIA with John McCone
and the mafia people like Frank Sturgis, who has been pinned to that. He was a former mafia man, a New York policeman.
22-page confession given the Cardinal Cook in 1971 as to his part in the assassination, according to the great detective there in New York City, Jim Rothstein. So all the evidence is still there to have a trial and to convict who did it. I mean, George Bush Sr. still lives, and he was involved in it. G. Gordon Liddy was involved in it. He still lives. William F. Buckley was involved in it. He still lives. Well, Inspector, he's a senator of Pennsylvania, I say with deep regret. He was involved in it. He still lives. All these guys can be indicted. But we don't have a Justice Department that will ever do it because it's controlled by the Vatican. There's Jesuits within the very Justice Department.
And one of your solutions, I think we should discuss this for a minute. If you went to the bottom of 9/11, as other people, like yesterday, Leo Zagami said, you will find that it goes to the Vatican, it goes through the High Cardinals, it goes through the Masonic lodges, all these people working together. I think people need to hear that this whole thing, this whole connection, how could they, in a sense, pull it off? I know it's so it's a very, very complicated story. There are many aspects to it. But Leo yesterday said, you bet the Black Pope was involved, and he knew, and he probably was organizing it because he's one of the most powerful men in the world.
Of course.
So take us down, made that path of those indictments going all the way to Borgo Santo Spirito Cinque, where the Black Pope resides.
I will tell you this. The reason why the Jesuits killed this story, and they don't want my exposure of Cardinal Spellman and the JFK murder, is because if the American Roman Catholic people found out who was behind this, they would revolt, and they would expel the entire Roman hierarchy from this country. And that's exactly what needs to be done, because it's a subversive organization. It's a brotherhood dedicated to the restoration of the Pope's temporal power and control in this country. It's treason. The Pope's temporal power is treason. And so when the American Roman Catholic people would wake up to this and realize that the Vatican kills their own Roman Catholic people, like that of Columbus, JFK, then they'll realize we're not safe serving Rome. We have no guarantee if we serve the Pope we're going to be saved. We're going to have our lives spared. That's time to expose it. And you know what? That's exactly what happened in Germany when all the Catholics in Germany demanded that the Jesuits be expelled from Germany in 1872. That's exactly when all the Catholics in France decided that they wanted the Jesuits out in 1880 under Gambetta, and also when they expelled them in 1902. And that stinking Pétain in Laval readmitted the Jesuits into France in 1942. So no, the Roman Catholic people, if they would understand, because really it is they who run the major cities, that's how the Jesuits have set it up, when they understand they're not safe and that there is no loyalty of their own Roman priesthood for them, that they would be sacrificed at the blink of an eye if deemed necessary, like 9/11, they will revolt. And that's the Achilles heel of all of this. Rome and the Archbishop can never be exposed. Egan can never be exposed, and there's other archbishops in this country. For if they are, they're out of here. And that's what we want.
And that's why when you go back and look at Spellman and how Jim Rothstein, the detective, nailed him to be involved in organizing the pedophile rings with hard evidence, he went to Morgenthau, and that was quashed immediately.
Exactly.
But he said this. He kept evidence by himself of a kid who was molested by Spellman, and he had the evidence of one of Cardinal Spellman's shoes or something that the kid stole. And he said this story perhaps may have saved his life and kept Spellman off his back, at least until he had to leave when they threatened his life, and he either had to leave the police department or be killed. But he said Morgenthau, who's still there right now, he's still the DA there, protected Spellman, because he called him the most evil man he's ever encountered, along with the most powerful in our country. And he said the power has now just been transferred to Cardinal Egan.
Is that what he said?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, he's right on target. And here's another example of the Pope's court Jews serving the Vatican. You got Robert Morgenthau. Jews serving the Vatican. You got Robert Morgenthau, who's a Jew.
You know,
what does he do? He's serving the Archbishop of New York.
Right.
You got Arlen Specter, who's a Jew, 33rd degree Freemason, Senator PA. What's he doing? Serving the Archbishop of New York. These are the Pope's court Jews, and they have deemed it necessary to be in alliance with the papacy for their survival. So they betray their own people.
Right. And so as they blame the Muslims and set the Muslims up for destruction, so they do with the Jews. And anytime you discuss this intelligently, you hear this, oh, no, it was the Zionists who did it. They're the ones involved in 9/11. They're the ones involved in bringing this country's banking system down. And I think you need to explain in the last few minutes, we got about 10 minutes left, how they use these scapegoats to protect themselves.
Well, the list of all the top American Masonic Jewish Zionists, or Masonic Jewish Labor Zionists, because there's 6 different Zionists, and I define this on a broadcast with Lenny Bloom, that these Zionists, Labor Zionists, most of them are members in the Council on Foreign Relations. You got Thomas Friedman, who wrote The World is Flat. And what's he doing? He's destroying the national sovereignty of America, outsourcing our jobs to India and other places because, the world is flat. You have a host of others that are members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Just get the annual report of the CFR for 2006, and you'll see all their names. It's in excess of probably 400 or 500 of the Masonic Jewish Zionists there. They're all serving the papacy. They're manning banks. They're manning positions of power in the Department of Justice and other places. They're all placed and their loyalty is with the Archbishop of New York through their membership in the Council on Foreign Relations. And it's this very Council on Foreign Relations. Perez comes and visits and gets his marching orders, et cetera, from the Knights of Malta, who run the Council on Foreign Relations there in New York City. So that's how it works. You always have the Pope's court Jews subordinate to the Gentile leaders of every nation.
And then they're easy to blame. They're right out there in front, right?
And they consent to be blamed, like Larry Silverstein.
Right.
Don't you know he consented to be blamed when he purchased the World Trade Center so that he could get how many billions in an insurance policy so that everyone can say, look who benefited?
Yeah.
The Jews.
Mm-hmm.
He willingly consented to this. Why? Because these Masonic Jewish labor Zionists working for the Vatican want to either kill every Jew in North America, like Bernard Baruch was one of them, or the ones that would survive to drive them back to the killing floor in the Middle East called Israel, because it's the Pope's intention to attempt to drive as many Jews there as possible so that ultimately he can kill them all and never be bothered with any Jew ever again, because they have the Abrahamic promise. But the Pope will be surprised, because at about that time, when he's about successfully able to do it as the Antichrist, the Messiah, the lowly Nazarene, will return. And this time, he's going to be the Lion of the tribe of Judah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, surprisingly, the word heretic's been used recently by Ratzinger, and also Pope John Paul II started this term heretic started to be used again. And I wanted you to explain to the American people why they're hearing this again and what they have planned in their bag of tricks.
Well, remember, the term heretic was officially done away with in Vatican II, because after Rome had washed her bloody hands of everything that she had accomplished in World War II, she wanted to appear to be a wonderful, peaceful church, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
So they did away with the title heretic for people such as myself. I would be termed an obstinate heretic. And they did away with the term perfidious Jews.
Mm-hmm.
Because the Pope always instructed his priests to pray for those perfidious Jews, quote unquote.
Mm-hmm.
So now it's going back to pre-Vatican II. It's going back to the old traditionalists, the old Tridentine, right-wing, fascist, intolerant, inquisitional papacy that it really is.
Mm-hmm.
And so no one better than Ratzinger would be able to do it, because he himself is a Jesuit coadjutor and the servant of Peter Hans Kolvenbach. And we must remember that the Jesuit order, in overseeing the papacy, the Jesuit order never changes. Semper idem, always the same. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, there will continue to be the murder of heretics, liberal Roman Catholics, perfidious Jews, infidel Muslims, as they coordinate their crusades under a political agenda when it is really a religious agenda.
Right, and I wanted you to comment about this. Ratzinger, of course, before he became Pope, was the head of the Office of Inquisition, which changed its name, but that's what it was. That's what it is. Now, I find it interesting that guess who was named his successor? It was Archbishop Levada from San Francisco. So why would they pick an American? Find it interesting, don't you? To head up the Office of Inquisition.
I find it very intriguing, because American cardinals usually do not occupy such a position of power. Well, it only goes to show that this American Levada is going to be the Grand Inquisitor for this crusade against North America. And we must remember, too, that all the genealogical records that the Mormons control is all subject to review by the Jesuits in control of the Mormon institution. Mm-hmm. All the intelligence agencies and their huge files on individuals, on every individual in this country, for example, is all subject to review by the Vatican's Holy Office of the Inquisition. The Social Security number numbered every American. All those numbers are recorded by the Vatican in the Vatican, so they know everything about us and can find anything out about us by merely picking up the phone and calling the IRS or the CIA or the FBI. It's an international inquisition controlled by the papacy.
And they'll have a book on you, I bet. You know what I mean?
I would imagine,
sure.
But I always try to remember this, that we are insignificant. What is significant is this story, is this message, of course, couched in the truths of the Word of God, the AB 1611 Bible. And if someone does away with me, which may very well happen, would to God the Lord would use someone else that's listening for the very same purpose, pick up where I left off, be familiar with all the texts of Vatican assassins, and begin to do your own reading. Because you can't kill tens of thousands of people who understand these things. You can kill 5 or 10 or 100 or 1,000, but you can't kill a whole population and eradicate this knowledge unless you have a huge inquisition and crusade.
And that's what they're planning.
Yes, that's right.
Yep. And in a sense, what stage are we at, according to you right now, for people who are insistent upon asking me, and I get emails like this all the time, how much time do we have, Greg, if what your guests are saying are true? When will this be a full-blown inquisition in America? What's your thoughts?
I never set a date, and I never bring out a timetable, because when it doesn't happen, then you're discredited.
Exactly.
All I attempt to do is tell this is what they're planning, this is what they put in place, this is what they want to do, and the Spirit of God is involved in either permitting it to succeed or restraining it, because he's the restrainer of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He that will letteth will let. He restrains right now. So I never set a time date, but I point to all the flags as to what they want to do, and then men and women in their place of influence, whether it be in court or whether it be in government or banking or at school, they can begin to exert their influence where they are for good and in resisting this, and it will be set back.
Exactly, restrained. And therein lies why they want to control the media, because the faster it gets out, the more restraint there'll be, and if they can keep this message limited, they have a better success rate. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. That's why they control the media. And hopefully, see, I believe in God is sovereign, and his sons gave all power in heaven and earth, and the heart of the king is in his hands. And in answer to our prayers, in seeking his face, he has the power to turn the heart of someone at NBC or ABC or even Fox, that would be a real miracle, to begin to tell the truth of what's really happening. And all it takes is one man. And then it begins to be an avalanche. Well, he said this, well, I'm going to say this. For example, when I was in Reno, I went to the gold area there in Virginia City and met a gentleman who was teaching us how to pan gold. And he said, well, yeah, we don't have any more gold anymore, and the bankers that control the gold, they have all this currency, and they can create unlimited credit so we can have our wars against the Muslims. I said, that's right. I said, because the Federal Reserve Bank is the Pope's bank. He said, the Pope's bank? I said, that's right. And some people were listening behind me. They got up and left. And he said, well, I have something for you. He said, Mary Jo Kopechne. He said, I know the man who buried her. I know the mortician. And he told me, and he was the last man alive that knew this, he told me when this guy was having a heart attack, he said that Mary Jo Kopechne was shot in the back of the head by Teddy Kennedy. She didn't drown. He shot her in the back of the head, and he saw a picture on TV of the blood Undertaker that told him. The Undertaker has since died, and this gentleman is the only man who knew this, and he